Hello and welcome to Coffee Time with Abgadeas. I am your host, Abgadeas, and this is the show where you just might see me take a sip of this coffee that is actually water today. But more or less, I'm just here to rant and rave about anything and everything that interests me. So today, we are once again returning to the Chinese balloon saga. Well, there are a couple updates in regards to the Chinese balloon. I more so want to have a bit of a conversation about one, why the mainstream media is pushing this story front and center over anything else, and then number two, the inevitable effect as well as the general direction that the West and America specifically is heading towards. So, first off, I'm sure most of you are aware, and if you're not, you can give a quick Google, you'll find lots of articles on this. But recently, there was a train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. This train derailment caused some chemicals to spill out into the ground, seep into the groundwater as well as the river water. And despite the fact that the EPA has told the residents of the nearby towns that it is safe to return, there are livestock, pets, fish all showing up dead, fish in the rivers, and of course livestock and pets in people's homes are showing up dead. And really, this isn't being talked about to any degree on the mainstream media. I'm seeing very little to nothing about it. I follow most of the major outlets, your CNN, NBC, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, all that good stuff, and I haven't seen them mention it once. And then secondly, the other big story that at least the American mainstream media isn't addressing, Canadian isn't either, for that fact, for a matter of fact. But that is the Seymour Hersh story about what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline. Not to go too heavily into it, I'll leave a link to that article down below as well. But basically, Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has been involved in quite a few investigations, is sometimes called a conspiracy theorist, but the things he's reported on and the stories he's broken have all, to my knowledge, proved to be true, and he is a very reliable source. And essentially what he is saying in his article is that it was specifically America, and more specifically a team of four people, Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, and Anthony Blinken, that were responsible for the decision to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. And what is kind of important about that is the Nord Stream pipeline, well, yes, it was a Russian pipeline. The other end of that pipeline was going to Germany, so it was as much Germany's pipeline as it was Russia's. And effectively, what this report means is that the president, as well as his security advisor and a few other people, circumvented Congress and conducted an operation that is basically an act of war, an attack on infrastructure, attacking the infrastructure of one of their closest NATO allies, which is Germany. You can even see Joe Biden on stage with Olaf Scholz a couple months before this happened, saying that Nord Stream is not going to happen, it's not going to exist, and when he was asked how, he just laughed about it. But essentially, yeah, the United States committed a direct act of war against Russia as well as its direct ally Germany, and the president did that by circumventing Congress and hiring Navy divers directly. And neither of these stories are being covered at all. But what is being covered is every single unidentified flying object that, because the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. State Department are now actually monitoring their high-altitude airspace, they're shooting down about anything and everything they can find in their high-altitude airspace. And that has been all the news on every channel other than the earthquake in Turkey, which is still a very tragic event and deserves coverage, don't get me wrong, but the train derailment and the Seymour Hersh story are getting almost no coverage in mainstream media. The latter of those stories, the Seymour Hersh article, basically meaning that the president has betrayed his mandate from the American people, as well as his obligations to Congress, to commit an act of war. And now I don't know much about the American public, but I would think at least the people on the right and the people that are farther left than liberals per se would be quite angry about this. I'm sure that everybody who's not a mega Democrat, like a MAGA Democrat, people that back Joe Biden no matter what, I'm pretty sure everybody that is outside of that camp is opposed to something like this, and they should be quite pissed off about the president conducting an act of war without consent of Congress and therefore the American people. But again, all that we hear about is the balloon story, because as I mentioned before, Mark Milley, I believe, is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. military. I'm not 100% sure on his position, but he's come out and said that war with China over the Taiwan Strait is likely to happen by 2025. And as well, you had the Rand Corporation, which is a U.S. think tank, as well as the CSIS War Games. You had both of those outlets release reports which were basically hinting at the idea that the United States can't support a war in Ukraine and a war in Taiwan against China. They kind of have to pick and choose, and most likely it should be the latter, the war with China over Taiwan, that the United States should choose. And by just a happy coincidence, the United States, not even a week or two after those reports came out, suddenly detected a balloon in their high altitude airspace. The Chinese took responsibility for it. The United States shot it down. The Chinese insisted that it was a weather balloon for meteorological purposes, but the U.S. State Department asserts that using the U2 scanners, I'm not entirely sure what those are at the moment. I should have wrote it down, but basically they were able to detect that there were antennae on the actual balloon itself that were capable of intercepting communications data, and then given that information, President Joe Biden made the decision to shoot it down. But since that incident, and the Chinese condemning the action, more or less, we've had 3 more unidentified flying objects get shot down over America as well as Canada. There was one shot down in northeast Alaska, one shot down over Lake Huron, which is one of the Great Lakes, and then one shot down over the Yukon, which is a Canadian province. And what is the most interesting about this is that the leading explanation coming directly out of the White House is that the balloons were commercial or benign. So that these other 3 balloons, these were not in fact Chinese surveillance balloons. They were most likely owned by a private company in some way, shape, or form. But they still hold true to the idea that the initial balloon was absolutely for espionage purposes. There is no possibility that any private corporation of any kind had it in their hand, or even a publicly owned corporation that is education or science-based, that it couldn't have been their balloon. The only possibility, according to the U.S. government, is that the Chinese Communist Party sent that balloon here to spy on us. Depending on who you talk to, some U.S. State Department officials insist that it was Xi Jinping himself that decided to send a giant, very slow, uncontrollable balloon over U.S. airspace. To my understanding, the balloon would have been able to collect data that satellites couldn't have. But the one point I want to bring up, and that I've kind of been thinking a little bit in my head, but not exactly in this way. This is a tweet here from Existential Comics, and I'm just going to read it out loud. The funniest part about the Chinese spy balloon is that people do know that Chinese people can just, like, come over here and walk around and take pictures and stuff, right? Next thing we know, the Chinese tourists are going to be spying on Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon. And this is kind of the second half of the issue I want to get into. I would agree, yes, China probably had a million better resources, a million better ways that they could have collected the data that they were trying to collect if this balloon was in fact for espionage purposes. But you can see here the insinuation that average Chinese people could be conducting espionage for the Chinese government. And while this particular individual is making that comment in jest, I'm sure anybody that is an American, even a younger American, a millennial age, Zoomer age, I'm sure you've seen somewhere in American media the hype, the Red Scare propaganda, the Russian spy fear, threat, the whole idea that through the Cold War, you never know who you're talking to. They could be a Russian spy or a Russian sleeper agent. And generally during the Cold War, this didn't have a very direct effect, at least in terms of the public reacting to it. But we've seen even over the last decade with rhetoric, especially around China, kind of amping up to a point that the U.S. is gearing up for war with China. We've seen just last year alone, anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339% nationwide. And now, if you think that is completely unrelated to the shift in rhetoric from the U.S. State Department, as Alexander McCurris would say, I have a very big bridge to sell you, sir. So it tends to be, I would say, a bit irresponsible to make connections without solid statistical evidence. But given this trend just over the last year, this report specifically comes from 2022. So I guess they'd be talking about the year of 2021. Other cities surpassing their record numbers in 2022. Okay, so yeah, this is talking about the year before, so it is talking about 2021. And that was directly after the COVID pandemic. And pretty much everybody universally accepted the explanation that it came out of Wuhan, China. Some people, perhaps a little more on the right, are under the belief that the COVID virus had to have been manufactured intentionally in a lab inside of Wuhan. And while I don't want to get into the specifics, I don't really want to have a debate on that. I have a completely different opinion on that entirely. But as a result of that sentiment and those feelings, we saw anti-Asian hate crime explode. So people just running up to Asian people on the streets, attacking them, attacking majority Asian churches, businesses. We've seen tons of incidents of just regular, maybe not everyday Americans, but of regular people committing these heinous acts against Asians, sometimes not even Chinese people, but just committing these acts because they believe that everything that is going wrong, the COVID pandemic, their government's poor response to the COVID pandemic, the absolute financial ruin that the West is driving itself to over sanctions against Russia that, even according to the IMF, aren't working. Even considering all of that, they blame all of that on the Chinese, that it is all the Chinese fault. So now the Chinese are spying on us. They have an advanced surveillance program. We've shot down 4 of their spy balloons just over the last week alone. You really think any of the people are that perpetuate this narrative and perpetuate anti-Asian hate, do you really think they're going to go the extra mile to find out that the White House themselves actually announced that these were most likely commercial or benign, and to my knowledge they still haven't confirmed a country of origin? I don't think most of those people are going to care. They heard Chinese spy balloon, Then they heard another balloon, another balloon, another balloon. So they think 4 Chinese balloons that the American government has shot down, and the Chinese government is here to spy on us and steal all of our information. As I mentioned before, if China really wanted to do that, it would probably be a lot easier to do that with the magical device that you volunteered and paid about $1,000 to go purchase and take home, that maintains your entire life, has your entire schedule, your emails, your personal thoughts, your information. It would be a lot easier to extract data using mobile devices or using online services, all this kind of stuff. But Chinese balloons, absolutely real. It's their espionage program. We gotta stop them. And it's definitely, it's gotten to a point, I think, I would hesitate to compare it maybe to the situation in World War II. I think with the direction we're leading towards, we're going to see kind of a McCarthyism 2.0. I think no coincidence that the Speaker of the House is named McCarthy at the moment. But if you don't know what McCarthyism is, it was basically the anti-communist Red Scare propaganda drive during the first half of the 20th century, basically to persecute and deal with anybody that was either a communist or had communist sympathies, or much worse, was a Russian asset, sleeper agent, spy, you name it, right? So that was kind of an all-around crackdown. I assume multiple innocent Americans that weren't even communists, perhaps that just showed up to a union meeting once or twice. I'm sure lots of people were lumped into there, but we're approaching a similar situation. And why I kind of want to harken it back to the Second World War is because I believe what we're marching towards, what we're going towards, the logical conclusion of what's going on here is that the United States is trying to go to war with China. And if they do get engaged in a direct conflict with China, a declared war, United States versus China, no proxy not being done through Taiwan, if it is an actual war, you're going to see the United States, maybe not under this current administration, it might take until the next administration, or it could take a couple months, it could take an incident to happen before these kind of policies get enacted, but I think we might see, in some way, shape, or form, a return to the Japanese and German internment camps we saw in World War II. And the reason I kind of hesitate to relate it to World War II is that I don't think it's going to be exactly the same setup, the same kind of camps or whatever. I think it's a lot more likely to be something a little more similar to the migrant crisis, the cages, the just kind of chain link fenced off areas that they had for migrants. But the second reason I don't think it's similar is because leading up to the Second World War, there were people that were concerned about what Hitler was doing. Hitler actually had a lot of sympathies inside the United States, and especially from the far right, the group of people that typically are gun-owning, a bit more anger-driven in their decision-making process. A lot of those people actually agreed with a lot of what Hitler was saying and a lot of what Hitler was doing. That's why there was an American Yahtzee party, if you know what I'm saying. So the hysteria in America, at least amongst the public, didn't really build up until the Second World War actually started and the United States actually got involved. Before that, people weren't as skeptical, they weren't as scared of Germans or Japanese. Obviously, before Pearl Harbor happened, they didn't really have any reason to be afraid of the Japanese or to be suspicious of them. So it's a lot different to today's situation where this has been building up, I'm sure, for decades and decades with Korean and Vietnam War vets, but it has kind of ramped back up in the last decade or so, more or less starting with Trump's presidential run, maybe a bit before that with some of the actions Obama was taking as well. But you kind of see this, what's supposed to be an anti-China sentiment amongst the public has turned into an anti-Asian sentiment, and anybody that even looks remotely Asian can be a target to one of these deranged people. And I'm sure you've seen at least a handful of these incidents. I could pull up dozens and dozens. This is just one from January of Mr. Christopher McCormack, who assaulted an Asian woman, pushed her on the ground. Obviously, this is a bit more of a minuscule incident, not to demean the actual importance or how much this woman suffered. But obviously, this is one of the more minor incidents. We're not talking about mass shootings or just murders, shootings, full-on assaults in general. But there are a lot of examples of this, of white-presenting, generally males, that just randomly attack Asians for whatever reason. I'm sure they have a very what seems to them to be a concise explanation and thought process on why they're doing what they're doing. But in general, it's just a result of the sentiment that China's bad, China enemy number one, everything Chinese bad, we need to attack China, we need to destroy China. And this is another anecdotal example, but just kind of going off what Existential Comics said in their tweet, you can see here, here's a post from somebody. I would assume that they're Chinese, but I don't know for sure. They just made a post, a nice little, friendly, innocent post. A good morning from the University of Chicago. It's cold, but the sun is out and my fingers are only semi-frozen. Very innocent, nothing political about it whatsoever. And tons of the comments, just casual racism, of course, but then you get the CCP spy. Correct acronym is CPC, but I'm not going to correct these types of individuals on that. The indoctrinated China man from UCLA in a city filled with leftist scum. Perfect fit. Chi-Com, so I'm assuming Chinese communist. Are you employed by the CCP? Do you work for the CCP? Take down the CCP, take down the CCP, take down the CCP, take down the CCP. So, I have to admit, I didn't do any research into this individual that posted the picture. I didn't pull up his Twitter profile, but I think I'm safe in assuming that at least some of these comments are made by people that didn't look at the profile either. They saw an Asian face and they're like, Chinese, bad, attack, attack, attack. And this is the mild version, right? This is the mild version. This is people sitting behind their keyboards, writing mean comments. This doesn't mean that it is inevitable that these people are going to go out and attack Asian people, but as this rhetoric continues to circulate and becomes normalized, it is going to turn into worse things. It's going to turn into violence. People, extremists, radicals, people that have felt cheated, have had their lives ruined through neoliberal policies exporting our jobs to China. Obviously, China didn't come here and steal any of the jobs. It was American corporations trying to make as much money as possible and looking for the cheapest manufacturing hub, which just happened to be China in a lot of those cases. But you have a lot of people that have suffered very dearly because of that. The concept I was talking about with Dylan Daniels on his show, that should be going up tomorrow, I believe. I'll have a link to his channel down below. But one concept I was talking to him about is the emasculation, per se, of the white American male. So the American dream was built on this precedent that a white male could have a single job that they attained straight out of high school, and that job can support them, a family, it can support buying a house, it can support buying a vehicle, maybe even more than one vehicle, it can even support buying some luxury goods and having a nice life. And obviously, that is not the case anymore. And because the Red Scare propaganda has been so bad in America, because America is so deficient of any sort of class analysis that tells us the rich people are doing things so they stay rich, and we stay poor. And as a result of this, all these things are happening. Instead of having that conversation or getting into that idea, these people that are disenfranchised by the various neoliberal policies inevitably just lash out. Whether, again, that's in some kind of comment section, or they just become bitter and reserved and they shout racial obscenities whenever they get the chance, or if they actually go out and commit violence against the people that they believe are at fault for the things that have happened to them. It leads to nothing good. And I guess one thing I would say, if you are Chinese, if you look Chinese, if you look Asian even, maybe not in Canada, I haven't seen this as much in Canada, but if you are living in the States, it's probably a good idea to find out how to go to another country. I would encourage you to return to China, but I know a lot of the Chinese living in America are living there specifically because they fled, or their grandparents, I guess, fled during the Chinese Revolution, mainly, usually because they either sympathized with the nationalists, or just in general, they didn't want to deal with the turmoil, they didn't want to deal with all this stuff. And most of those people that have been in the West for generations, they share this similar, in my opinion, a tainted view, but a very hostile view towards China, the Chinese Communist Party, and communism in general. So I don't think a lot of people are going to want to go back to China. I'm sure if you're Chinese, even by descent, there is a way that China will accept you back. I'm not entirely sure on that, but definitely get out of America before the internment camps start opening up. And I really don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but this is getting to a point that is pretty scary, and it's going to get to a point, I think, where especially people on the right, the public are going to be so distrustful of anything Chinese, anything Asian, anything that even looks remotely Asian, that there's even going to be a public demand for the government to react, to respond to this in some way. I mean, we've seen the absolutely ignorant, racist comments that I get, even on my last video, and I'm still a white-presenting male that generally doesn't talk about race issues. I mean, really, this is the second video that I'm even talking about race issues, and I still see this absolutely nonsensical garbage coming out of absolutely reactionary members of the working class that it scares me to no end. And I hate to think that once this conflict does escalate and does turn into a war, I really hate to think about what's going to happen to the Chinese/Asian people that are in America today. But more or less, that is all for me today. I am scared and saddened by this, but I think it is something we all need to be aware of and we need to prepare for, because it is not going anywhere anytime soon. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching, everybody that has watched so far, everybody that consistently watches, and everybody that just tunes in once in a while. If you do have anything you'd like me to talk about, any topics, any news stories you'd like me to dive a bit further into, please do leave it as a comment down below. I will get to it once I feel I am properly prepared to actually discuss the topic. I am working on quite a few videos right now, but I believe I'm going to try to do my next one tomorrow about this derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, not Palestine, but East Palestine, Ohio. And hopefully I should be able to release that tomorrow. If not, I may make another video. I really don't know. But again, thank you so much for watching, and you have a good